It is a curious thing how the silence of a room can feel heavier than its noise. I remember the flame, most of all the candle burning low on a table in my room, bending in the faint draught that crept beneath the sash window. Oxford has its own stillness after dark, not empty but weighted, as though the stone walls themselves are listening. I had intended only to sit for a few minutes, the crossword folded neatly at my side, a glass of whisky breathing its vapours on the arm of the chair. Yet time has a habit of slipping away in such company, and the wax dripped steadily, counting its own hours more honestly than any clock. That evening I had not yet met the dead man, though in retrospect his presence was already everywhere. The letter on my desk bore his name tentatively, a cramped hand, ink blotted near the salutation. There is always something revealing in the opening line of a letter. People strive for formality and only betray themselves further. His began with an apology for writing at all, which told me more than his 2 pages of confession. A man who apologizes for existing usually has something to hide. It was, as Lewis would later remark, a curious business from the start, as senior Don at St. Ethelwald's, by all accounts respected, perhaps even feared, had asked me to meet him in the cloister library. Midnight of all hours. I turned the letter over again and again in my hands. He hinted at scandal, at a secret gnawing away in the very heart of the college. There was mention of betrayal, of a manuscript better left unread. He wrote that he feared for his life, though such words are often chosen for their drama rather than their accuracy. Still I noted the tremor in the hand, the uneven strokes. A man rattled, certainly. The flame wavered. I thought of the last clue I had scribbled down in my crossword earlier that evening. Deceptive light in academic circle 7. At the time, I had left it blank. Now, staring at the candle, I wondered whether the answer was not some neat wordplay, but rather Oxford itself, that great deceptive light, its learned calm masking all manner of private shadows. I pulled on my coat. The whisky remained unfinished, and so did the crossword. Both have a way of waiting patiently. The walk across town was damp, the cobbles slick from earlier rain. The lamplight fell unevenly, making small pools of radiance that dissolved into long avenues of darkness. I thought of his choice of place, the cloister library. I had been there many times before. Oak panelling, narrow ladders, dust lying undisturbed on shelves of sermons and half-forgotten histories. The library is a place that stores not just books but silences, the silences of readers, of secrets, of generations who had chosen to hide their truths among the vellum and paper. I arrived before midnight. The great wooden door groaned faintly when I pushed against it, and the sound seemed to echo far beyond its size. No one was there at first. I remember the strange relief of finding it empty, and then the unease that followed. I lit one of the wall sconces, its wick reluctant, and cast a thin glow along the row of chained volumes. A chair scraped faintly in the gallery above. He descended the staircase slowly, his gown brushing the steps like a shadow lengthening. He was taller than I remembered from formal occasions, or perhaps the darkness lent him stature. He carried no candle, though I could smell on him the faint mineral scent of old wax. His face was pale, lined more by thought than age, and when he spoke it was in a low tone, almost ashamed of the words. I will not recount all he told me, partly because much of it was muddled, and partly because the night has since blurred. But I recall certain fragments, a disputed inheritance, a text misattributed, a betrayal not of flesh but of ink. He spoke of another Don, younger, ambitious, ruthless, in his pursuit of recognition. There had been arguments in the common room, whispers in the quadrangles, an unsigned note slipped beneath his door. He feared exposure, but exposure of what? he never quite admitted. I watched his hands as he talked. Long, delicate fingers, but restless. They played with the edge of his sleeve, tugged once at the chain of his watch, then clutched briefly at the railing. A guilty man always tries to occupy his hands, as though their stillness might reveal too much. I asked him why it was midnight. He gave a smile that had no humor in it. "Because there is no hour later than midnight," he said. A curious reply, one I carried with me long afterwards. When I left him, he seemed calmer, though not settled. He promised to send me something in the morning, a copy, he said, of the very document that bound him in fear. I did not press. Too often pressure produces silence, while patience draws the truth into the open. Back in my room, the candle had burned down almost to the brass socket. The crossword lay where I had left it. I filled in the clue that had troubled me earlier. Illusion. It seemed to fit a deceptive light in academic circles. I closed the book, the wax guttered. Outside, the bells of Christchurch told the hour. I should have known then, but deduction, like grief, often arrives too late. The morning arrived with a kind of bruised light, hesitant and pale, as though reluctant to admit what the night had already prepared. I remember the drizzle most of all, a thin mist of rain that settled into the collars of passers-by, soaking their scarves, and the headlines of the newspapers left outside the tobacconist. Oxford in the rain is hardly remarkable, but there was a stillness in that morning that unsettled me before I had even crossed the quad. The bells of St. Mary's tolled faintly as if wrapped in wool, and the stones underfoot glistened like secrets too well polished to reveal anything willingly. I had not slept. The letter, the man, the promise of some document to be delivered in daylight, all had kept me staring at the ceiling long past the hour when dawn seeped reluctantly into the room. The crossword lay unfinished again, though I had turned over a clue in my mind through the dark hours. Forgotten volume lies within catalogue entry 9. The words looped round and round as though they might lead me to him. Forgotten catalogue volume. The kind of clue that hints at loss long before it speaks of books. Lewis found me near the cloister by 8:30. His coat was already damp, his hair matted from the drizzle. "There's been trouble at St. Ethelwold's, sir," he muttered in the half-whisper of a man reluctant to deliver bad news. "A don found dead in the library. Heart, they're saying, but the porter's in a state, swears he heard something in the night. I told him to wait for you." I said nothing for a moment. Only the faint rustle of the rain on the umbrella he carried filled the gap between us. A heart, perhaps, but I thought of the restless hands, the tremor in his voice, and the curious smile when he told me there was no hour later than midnight. We walked together, our steps echoing through the empty lane. Oxford students were still abed, or else too hungover from the night before, to notice two policemen slipping past them. The library loomed ahead, a dark box of stone, windows smeared with rain. Inside, the porter was waiting, red-faced and shaking, muttering about the wrongness of it all. His words came in spurts, half caught in his throat, but the shape of the story was clear enough. The body found slumped in the catalogue room, a candle burned to a nub at his elbow, and a volume open before him as though he had fallen asleep reading. I knew better. Death in libraries rarely arrives with such courtesy. The catalogue room has always struck me as a place of quiet desperation. Endless drawers, slips of card, ink fading to near invisibility. A graveyard of references, each pointing to something that once mattered to someone. I have spent too many hours in such rooms, searching for a book that never existed, a citation that evaporated under scrutiny. It seemed oddly fitting that he should be found there, face pressed against the register of all things half remembered. He looked smaller than the night before. Death does that, contracts a person, pares them down to their most ordinary shape. The robe was gathered awkwardly around him, one sleeve twisted, the watch chain broken and dangling like a snapped thread. His eyes were closed, mouth parted slightly, as though the words he had intended to speak had betrayed him at the final moment. The candle by his side had burned through the wax and guttered in a pool of grease. Beside it lay a folded scrap of paper, no larger than a train ticket, half hidden beneath his hand. Lewis bent first, but I stopped him. Some things are best seen before they are touched. The paper was smudged, faint with candle smoke, but the words were still legible. Beware the false. Illumination. Beneath it, a line of Latin, unevenly scrawled, lux mendax lumen est. I did not need to translate for Lewis, though he looked at me expectantly. A lying light is light nonetheless. I felt the same chill then that I had felt when he smiled in the shadows of the library stair. No hour later than midnight. No light is honest, whether flame or knowledge. The doctor was called, of course, and the college authorities gathered like blackbirds around a plough. There were murmurs of natural causes, of long-standing ailments, of pressure from duties too heavy for a man of his years. But I watched their faces. One looked away too quickly when I asked who else had access to the catalogue room. Another coughed into his hand, as though to disguise a smirk. Secrets never hide well in a room full of scholars, too many minds trained to observe what they pretend not to see. I took note of the open volume, not a theological tract, not the sermons of some long-dead bishop, but the library catalogue itself, drawer after drawer of names and call numbers. The slip he had left open read simply, "Manuscript, author uncertain, 17th century." Margin annotations in Latin and Greek. Restricted. The handwriting was his. I recognized it at once, but the cross mark beside it was faint, like the stroke of a distracted hand was not. Someone else had handled this catalogue, and recently. Lewis busied himself with the porter, asking about locked doors, about who had entered after hours. The man swore only the Don himself had the keys, though he faltered when I asked about the younger scholar the dead man had named the night before, the ambitious one. There was, of course, always an ambitious one. Oxford breeds them as fast as it breeds cynics. I bent once more over the body. His right hand was clenched, as if around something now absent. Not paper, not cloth, but the shape suggested something narrower, harder. A pen, perhaps, or a key. It left a faint impression even in death, the way a ring will leave its mark long after the gold has gone. Later, when the coroner made his notes, he would write simply of cardiac arrest. Nothing unusual, but I knew better. Death in a library rarely has anything to do with the heart, and everything to do with the words that surround it. We left the room sealed, though I carried with me the echo of that Latin phrase, the warning scrawled in haste, "Beware the false illumination," and the crossword clue that had dogged me through the night seemed to fold into it with curious neatness. Forgotten volume lies within catalogue entry 9. The answer came to me suddenly as we walked back across the quad, Lewis muttering about tea and dry socks. Palimpsest, a manuscript written over, hiding its original beneath. A false illumination indeed. The rain thickened. I pulled my coat tighter. Somewhere in Oxford a murderer was already at work in the margins, rewriting the text of another man's life. And I, foolish enough, had been asked to read between the lines. There is a peculiar echo that belongs only to cloisters, a sound less of footsteps than of memory, as if each stride summons all those that came before it. That morning, When I found myself walking beneath the long vaulted arches of St. Ethelwold's, the air seemed weighted with such echoes. The rain had slackened, but the stone still breathed its dampness, a mingling of moss, cold iron, and incense carried faintly from the chapel. Students drifted silently in gowns that flapped like the wings of startled birds, their eyes averted as though unwilling to acknowledge the shadow that death had cast so near. Lewis kept pace with me, though his gait was never built for subtlety. He had already remarked twice on the chill and once on the smell. I let him fill the silence because silence, too early broken, is of less use to me. The death in the catalogue room had unsettled him, not because of its strangeness, but because of its plausibility. A heart failing, a man of late middle age, a night alone in the library, everything suggested nature had taken its course. And yet I knew better. His clenched hand, the Latin warning, the reference to a restricted manuscript they whispered too insistently to be coincidence. The cloisters circle the central quad like a necklace of shadow. On the north side, the door to the library remained barred, a crimson seal pressed across its frame to appease both superstition and regulation. On the south, the chapel doors stood ajar, and a chorister's voice slipped out like smoke, thin and unsteady in its practice. I paused, listening. Music in Oxford always feels like a half-finished equation, each note asking for its complement, its counterpoint. I thought of the dead man, bent over his catalogue, caught between what was remembered and what was erased. A palimpsest indeed. We were met in the east cloister by the subwarden, a man of spare frame and deliberate movements, his eyes hooded as though he read the world from behind smoked glass. He spoke at once of the tragedy, of the sorrow felt by the college, of the loss to scholarship. His words were well chosen, too well chosen, as though recited from a script polished in advance. When I asked if he had known the dead man well, he inclined his head just enough to suggest intimacy without proof. He gestured toward the chapel as if grief required sanctity to make it credible. The cloisters amplify hesitation. Each pause in speech lingers longer than intended. Each sigh carries farther than one wishes. It was in one such pause that I noticed the young scholar loitering at the far end, feigning a fascination with the stone effigies of forgotten benefactors. His gown was ill-fitted, his hair damp and untamed, his eyes too bright for so grey a morning. When the sub-warden excused himself, the young man stepped forward, almost eagerly, as though the stage had cleared for his entrance. He introduced himself as a fellow newly elected, with a discipline in antiquarian studies that sounded suspiciously broad. His words rushed, spilling over each other in nervous abundance, as though he feared silence more than inaccuracy. He spoke of the dead man as a mentor, a rival, an obstacle, a mirror, his relationship undefined, shifting with every sentence. I listened, offering only a nod here, a murmur there, and watched his hands. They were elegant hands, long-fingered, restless, not unlike the hands of the man who now lay in the coroner's care. But where the elder's hands had betrayed unease, these revealed ambition, the small clenches of impatience, the smoothing of gown folds, the invisible grasp at opportunities not yet his. Lewis asked a question, something blunt, about whether the young scholar had seen the deceased the night before. The reply came too quickly, no hesitation, no trace of memory summoned. No, of course not. He had been in his room preparing a lecture. His voice carried the brittle certainty of someone rehearsed. I thought of the porter's hesitation when I had asked the same question earlier. Too many denials too soon form a pattern all their own. We continued beneath the arches, our footsteps marking a rhythm against the stone. A sparrow darted through one of the open lancets, briefly disturbing the dust that clung to the ledges. I thought again of the Latin warning, "Beware the false illumination." It was easy to ascribe such words to manuscripts, to the marginalia of scholars long dead. But what if the warning was meant for the living? A scholar's brilliance can blind as readily as a candle's flame. And ambition, in Oxford, is rarely satisfied with the ordinary light of day. The crossword from my pocket returned unbidden to mind. Clue 14, down Cloister Walk, conceals sin 5. I had stared at it earlier without a solution. Now, pacing beneath the arches, the answer revealed itself almost slyly. Eisel. The walk itself, but also the passage of a chapel, where sins are confessed in whispers, half hidden, half revealed. Cloisters conceal as much as they connect. They are places where truth echoes, but does not always arrive. Lewis, oblivious to such deductions, had already begun speculating aloud. He thought the man's death was natural, but he could not square it with the note left behind. He asked whether scholars often scribbled Latin warnings to themselves. I told him they did, though not usually at the moment of their heart's last contraction. He frowned, his breath rising visibly in the damp air. I spared him further comment, but my mind circled back to the clenched hand, to the absent object that had once filled it. Whatever had been removed from that grasp, pen, key, or clue, had been taken quickly, decisively, and with intent. We reached the west cloister, where a statue of the college founder presides with eternal disapproval. Rain had gathered in the folds of the stone robes, dripping steadily onto the worn paving below. The young scholar had drifted after us, or perhaps he had always been there, shadowing our steps with his own. He lingered close enough to overhear, but not to intrude. When I turned suddenly, his eyes dropped to the ground too swiftly. It was not shame I saw, but calculating the mind of a man already revising his account of the night. The cloisters ended where the porter's lodge began. There, life intruded once more, the clatter of keys, the murmur of a delivery boy, the hiss of a kettle boiling somewhere behind the wall. Lewis muttered something about needing breakfast. I let him go ahead. I remained a moment longer, gazing down the empty stone walk, the rain returning in thin threads across the flagstones. The cloisters have always been corridors of transition, where the living pass between chapel, library, hall, between knowledge, devotion, sustenance. But they are also corridors of silence, where secrets grow fat in the shadows and footsteps echo long after their makers have gone. When I finally stepped out into the quad, the bells marked the hour once more. Their chimes carried across the mist with the inevitability of time itself. Another hour claimed, another life reduced to memory. And I, walking away from the cloisters, carried with me the certainty that death had not yet finished its lesson in St. Ethelwold's. It is one of the peculiarities of Oxford that the most profound silences often occur not in the library or the chapel, but in the common room. There, amid the detritus of breakfast-congealed yolk, the faint aroma of coffee, newspapers folded into submission, the silence is born not of reverence, but of calculation. Men weigh their words, their reputations, their alliances, and often discover it safer to remain quiet. I have always preferred silence to speech, but that morning it pressed upon me with an unfamiliar weight. Perhaps it was because the chair at the far end of the table stood empty, his gown still draped across it like a ghost reluctant to leave. Lewis had gone to speak with the coroner, leaving me to the rituals of the college. The dons moved with studied nonchalance, shuffling their notes, muttering about lectures, yet each carried a nervous glance tucked between their gestures. Death had disrupted the fragile ecosystem of their common life, and the disturbance rattled them more than they wished to admit. I sat near the window, the drizzle tracing erratic patterns down the panes, and unfolded a newspaper as camouflage. In truth, I was listening, watching. waiting for something unguarded to slip through. On the table before me lay the crossword, abandoned by some earlier scholar. The ink had smudged in the damp air, but the grid still held its small universe of deceit and revelation. I picked it up idly, though idleness was a lie I told myself. Crosswords have always been less diversion than discipline, the neat interplay of surface and depth, of truth hidden in misdirection. A man can learn much from the way another fills his squares. Confidence in bold letters, hesitation in half-erased attempts, pride in obscure solutions. This puzzle bore several different hands, at least three, by my reckoning suggesting a communal effort over coffee and whispers. There was something curiously democratic in that even the most arrogant Don humbled before the tyranny of a clue. I lingered over 12 across Scholar Conceal's secret resentment. 6. Someone had written envy, then half-heartedly rubbed it away. The faint impression of the word remained, its ghost visible beneath the attempted correction. I smiled faintly. Scholars rarely erase their envy successfully. It lingers always beneath the surface, however much they disguise it with civility. Another clue, 9 down, library drawer, holds altered table 7. The answer, it seemed to me, could only be anagram, the simplest of deceptions hidden in plain sight. Yet it was left blank, as though no one had wished to acknowledge the possibility of stories deliberately rearranged. It was then that I noticed the younger scholar, the one whose eyes had glimmered too brightly in the cloisters. He entered the room with a confidence bordering on insolence, greeting one colleague, ignoring another, pausing just long enough by the empty chair at the far end to make his gesture seem accidental. But nothing in him was accidental. He moved with the energy of one who sees gaps where others see walls, who measures opportunities by their absence. He glanced at me and quickly away again, then busied himself with the teapot. His hands trembled slightly, though whether from nerves or eagerness I could not yet decide. I folded the crossword neatly, slid it into my pocket, and watched. He settled near a cluster of fellows who were deep in talk of endowments and examinations. His contributions were sparse, but he laughed a fraction too readily, as though rehearsing belonging. I noted the way he touched his cuff twice in as many minutes, as if checking for something hidden there. Habit is often the surest betrayer. When he finally rose, leaving half his tea untouched, I followed at a discreet distance. The common room emptied gradually, the day's duties calling each man to his lecture or his notes. I lingered, returning to the crossword in my hand. Scholars conceal secret resentment. Envy. The library drawer holds altered tables. Anagram. These were not mere clues, they seemed to speak directly of the world I found myself walking in. Envy concealed, tales altered, libraries transformed into theatres of deceit. Lewis returned then, looking as though the coroner had drained from him what little colour the morning had left. "Nothing certain," he muttered. Heart still the official line. But he frowned as he spoke, and I knew he trusted the verdict as little as I did. I showed him the crossword, pointing to the half-erased answer. He grunted, unimpressed. "You think that means something, sir?" I told him everything means something, provided one listens long enough. He shook his head, muttering again about tea. The common room grew quieter, the fire burning low in the grate. Outside, the drizzle had thickened into rain, striking the windows with insistence. I thought again of the folded note in the catalogue room, "Beware the false illumination." A crossword, too, is a false illumination, offering the promise of truth while concealing it in misdirection. Each answer only uncovers more questions, more interlocking deceptions. The dead man had been playing such a game in his final hours, whether with manuscripts or with men. I left the room with the crossword folded in my pocket, its unfinished squares pressing against me like unanswered accusations. The cloisters beyond were empty, save for the drip of rain through the gutters and the faint echo of my own footsteps. Oxford seemed to close in around me, its stones heavy with centuries of half-told stories, its corridors whispering of ambitions disguised as scholarship, of resentments etched in ink. Somewhere within those walls the truth waited, palimpsest upon palimpsest, and I, a fool or detective, had been given the task of deciphering it. The bells rang at noon, their sound muffled by the rain, and I thought of the crossword clue again. Scholars conceal secret resentment, envy. Not an answer erased, but an answer revealed, however faint. Confessions rarely arrive in the shape one expects. They are seldom whispered in shadows or scrawled in ink across trembling hands. More often they come as fragments, broken pieces of speech scattered in the air of a half-empty room, each sentence weighted with something unsaid. That afternoon, in a chamber at St. Ethelwold's that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, I was given such fragments by the young scholar whose ambition had already marked him in my thoughts as dangerous. He spoke too much, and not enough. The room itself was unremarkable, high windows streaked with rain, the hum of a radiator struggling to keep its promise of warmth, a desk scarred with the initials of generations who had tried to leave something permanent behind. The air carried the faint odor of polish, the kind applied quickly by a scout hoping to disguise years of neglect. He stood when I entered, though the gesture was rehearsed, not respectful. His eyes flicked towards the door as though measuring his chances of escape even while inviting me in. Lewis had remained outside, claiming paperwork, though I suspected he wished merely to be rid of the tension that seemed to thicken whenever this young man spoke. I accepted a chair, leaned back deliberately, and waited. Silence, I have always found, is the surest prompter of confession. He did not keep me waiting long. He began with abstractions, the cruelty of scholarship, the tyranny of tradition, the blindness of those who worshipped dusty manuscripts as though they were scripture. His words, poured out in carefully constructed sentences, the kind that might impress a seminar but reveal little. Yet there was heat beneath them, and heat always distorts. He called the dead man obstinate, narrow-minded, a gatekeeper who had stood between him and recognition. And then, almost as an afterthought, he added that the old man had been afraid of exposure, afraid of the truth being dragged into the light. I asked him what the truth was. He hesitated, and in that hesitation I caught the first glimmer of something genuine. His gaze shifted to the window, following the streaks of rain as though they might arrange themselves into words. He muttered of a manuscript, the same I had seen marked in the catalogue, whose margins contained notes not of theology, but of scandal, written in a hand that some had attributed, rashly, to a figure of great repute. If such an attribution were proved false, reputations would crumble. If it were proved true, careers might be made overnight. The dead man, he claimed, had been determined to suppress it. He, by contrast, wished it to be known. I thought again of the warning scribbled in haste, "Beware the false illumination." A manuscript whose margins offered illumination, perhaps but a deceptive one. Was the dead man protecting the world from a lie, or protecting himself from discovery? And what of this eager scholar whose confession seemed less about guilt than about ambition? A confession of motive, not of deed. He spoke faster now, the words tumbling, his hands restless upon the desk. He declared that on the night of the death he had not left his rooms. Yet his voice betrayed the very certainty he sought to claim. People who lie about absence always say too much. They decorate their denial with unnecessary detail, as though to prove what silence alone should suffice. He spoke of the essay he had been drafting, of the lamp that burned until 2, of the cigarettes smoked down to ash. None of it asked for, none of it credible. I pressed no further. It is in restraint that confession often deepens. Instead, I unfolded the crossword I had carried from the common room. I pointed to a clue left blank by all who had tried their hand. Manuscript altered, truth erased 8. His eyes flickered just briefly, with something more than recognition. Guilt, perhaps, or desire. I told him the answer was redacted. He smiled thinly, but said nothing. Silence, this time, spoke louder than denial. There was in his manner a curious blend of pride and fear, pride in what he believed he knew, fear of what I might already suspect. He tapped his fingers against the desk, a nervous rhythm that betrayed his impatience. At one moment he leaned forward, voice low, suggesting that perhaps the old man had taken his own life, burdened by secrets too heavy to carry. At another, he leaned back, shrugging as though the matter were trivial, inevitable, hardly worth the investigation. Such contradictions betray more than any confession. They reveal the restless calculations of a man still deciding which story will best serve him. I left him with little more than he had offered at the start, fragments, contradictions, half-truths disguised as insight. Yet I carried away something more valuable than confessing the certainty of his presence within the web. A man so entangled cannot escape, however carefully he tugs at the threads. Outside, the cloisters smelled of damp stone and rain-drenched ivy. Lewis rejoined me, asking if I had got anything useful. I told him only that every confession is useful, even when it conceals more than it reveals. He frowned, muttered something about riddles, and suggested we find food. But I lingered, the crossword still in my hand, the word redacted glaring up at me like a scar. Manuscript altered, truth erased. Wasn't that what all of Oxford was built upon, palimpsests of half-truths, reputations scrawled over reputations, light upon light, until the original darkness was forgotten? The bells tolled the hour once more, mournful in the damp air. I thought of the dead man's clenched hand, of the absent object, of the warning in Latin. Lux mendax lumen est. False light is still light. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether truth in Oxford was ever more than a shadow cast upon stone. There are scents that linger long after their source has vanished, and none more insistent than the smoke of a candle. That faint, acrid sweetness haunted me throughout the day, clinging not merely to my clothes, but to thought itself. Every corridor of St. Ethelwold seemed to carry it, as if the dead man's extinguished flame had woven its way into the very stones. Death often leaves such reminders, not in the form of corpses or reports, but in sensations that resist explanation. It is the persistence of absence that unsettles most. Lewis remarked upon it first, though with less poetry. "Smells like someone's been burning wax all night, sir," he muttered as we passed the chapel steps. I said nothing, though I too noticed it. The porter insisted that the candle had burned only in the catalogue room, where the body was found. Yet as we walked through the cloisters I caught its trace again, faint but undeniable, as though other flames had flickered unseen. I wondered how many candles had burned that night, and for what purpose. The college grew restless with speculation. Whispers darted along corridors like mice. Some spoke of scandal, others of natural tragedy. A few, with the sharp scent of self-preservation about them, suggested the matter ought to be hushed entirely. In Oxford, silence is often the preferred remedy. But I had no patience for it. A man's clenched hand, a broken chain, a Latin warning, these are not the furniture of natural death. I returned alone to the library that evening, the rain still fretting against the windows, the air heavy with that same faint smoke. The door to the catalogue room remained sealed, but I lingered in the stairwell where I had first met the man in his gown. The shadows there seemed longer now, stretched thin by memory. I lit my own candle, more for symbolism than necessity, and let its glow play across the oak panelling. The smoke it released curled upward, hesitant, before dispersing into the rafters. I watched it as one watches a thought forming, fragile and incomplete. In such moments the mind drifts toward deduction without forcing it. I recalled the crossword still folded in my pocket, the unfinished clue I had neglected all day. Smoke conceals truth at last. 5. The answer came easily. Now hazes, plural because there are always more than one. The candle's smoke was only one haze. Ambition, envy, secrecy, these formed the rest. Each obscured truth, each refracted light until one no longer knew what was genuine and what was illusion. As I leaned against the railing, I noticed a mark on the wood, faint but irregular. A dark smudge, too high to be dust, too low for careless polish. I touched it. Wax, hardened, brittle at the edges, as though a candle had been set here in haste, its flame left to drip unattended. Why would a man bring a candle to the stairwell when sconces burned in the walls? Unless he sought light where none should be. Unless another, following him, wished to see without being seen. The deduction was not proof, but it whispered insistently. More than one candle had burned that night. More than one figure had moved through these passages, carrying light into darkness and leaving behind only smoke. I thought of the porter's fumbling testimony, of the young scholar's restless hands, of the subwarden's polished sorrow. Any of them might have walked these stairs, candles trembling in hand, their secrets illuminated for a moment before vanishing into shadow. Lewis arrived as I stood there muttering something about supper. He saw the wax and dismissed it. Could have been there for years, sir. I told him perhaps, though the colour of it was too pale, too clean, not yet discoloured by time. He frowned, unwilling to follow the thread, preferring certainties to suspicions. I envied him that simplicity. For me, suspicion is the only certainty. We left the library and crossed the quad. The rain had ceased, but the air remained damp, heavy with the scent of extinguished wicks. In the common room, a fire struggled to catch, releasing more smoke than warmth. I sat with a whisky and unfolded the crossword once more. Hazes, I wrote in firm letters. It seemed almost an act of resignation. Oxford itself was a haze, its traditions and reputations clouding whatever truths might lie beneath. And I, stubborn as ever, insisted on seeing through it, though the candle's smoke stung my eyes. Later in my room, I found myself replaying the dead man's words. There is no hour later than midnight. A phrase that had seemed curious at the time now carried the echo of prophecy. Midnight is when candles burn low, when smoke curls into the rafters, when truth lies hidden in haze. Perhaps he had known what awaited him. Perhaps he had spoken not in metaphor, but in resignation. I poured another measure of whisky, watched its amber surface tremble in the light, and thought again of the clenched hand. Whatever object had been taken from his pen, key, or secret, it was the one thing he had tried to hold even as death approached. And someone else, carrying their candle, had taken it from him, leaving only wax, smoke, and silence in their wake. The night deepened. I closed the crossword, extinguished my lamp, and lay listening to the rain return. Yet still the scent of the candle clung to me, as though the dead man's flame had not yet gone out, but lingered, accusing somewhere in the corridors of St. Ethelwald's. The most dangerous moment in any investigation is not when one knows nothing, but when one believes one knows too much. False solutions carry their own gravity, drawing thought toward them like lodestones, only to collapse in the hand when weighed. That week in Oxford I nearly surrendered to such gravity. The pieces seemed to align, the motives arranged themselves, and the story told itself too fluently. I should have distrusted fluency from the beginning. It was the young scholar who tempted me toward certainty. His words in that cramped room still rang with a confession of ambition, if not of guilt. He wanted the manuscript released, the dead man silenced, the truth or the illusion of truth made public. It all fitted too easily, the restless hands, the hurried denials, the faint smile when the word redacted appeared in the crossword. He had cause, opportunity, and the brittle arrogance of youth. What more was needed? Lewis, bless him, wanted it settled at once. He argued the case over shepherd's pie in the common dining hall, steam rising from his plate while he gestured with his fork. "The lad's guilty, sir. You can see it plain as day." I let him speak, half listening, my eyes drawn instead to the windows where rain blurred the lamps outside. Plain as day, he had said. Yet Oxford knows no plain days. Every hour is fogged with precedent, layered with disguise. Still, I allowed myself to draft the solution in my mind. The young scholar, determined to expose what the elder wished to hide, had followed him into the library at midnight. There, among drawers of fading catalogues, he had confronted his rival, pressed him with words sharper than knives, and in the struggle, or the silence that followed, the elder's heart had faltered. A candle burned down, a warning was scribbled, a hand clenched around a final secret. The story had a shape, it breathed, it beckoned me toward closure. That night in my room I poured a whiskey and unfolded the crossword once more. One clue stared at me like an accusation. Deceptive answer leads astray. 6. The letters I had filled suggested mirage, and it seemed apt. I wrote it down firmly, convinced that at last the puzzle was moving toward completion. Mirage, a false solution. The irony was lost on me then, though it would not be for long. The next morning we called the scholar again, this time to the porter's lodge where the smell of damp stone mingled with pipe smoke. Lewis asked the questions, blunt and insistent. Where had he been? Who could vouch for him? Why had he spoken of the manuscript with such fervour? The young man fenced with his words, but his thrusts were clumsy, his parries too quick. He grew flustered, tapped his foot, adjusted his cuff. All the while I sat silent, watching the smoke curl upward from the porter's forgotten pipe. I was convinced of his guilt, convinced enough to taste the relief of resolution. And yet it is always the smallest thing. The porter, fumbling with his keys, mentioned in passing that he had seen light beneath the library door long after midnight. 2 candles, he said, not one. The flames had moved differently, as though borne by separate hands. He had dismissed it as imagination, too fearful to intrude. But the words clung to me with the weight of wax itself. 2 candles, 2 figures. If the scholar had been there, he would not have been alone. The mirage began to dissolve. My neat solution, so carefully arranged, wavered like heat on a desert road. I left the lodge unsettled, the crossword heavy in my pocket. Mirage. The clue had solved itself, not on the page, but in my own error. I had believed in the neatness of motive, the tidiness of ambition. But Oxford does not deal in tidiness. Its truths are always plural, its lights always doubled, its shadows always overlapping. Lewis sensed my hesitation as we crossed the quad. "You don't think it was him, sir?" he asked, incredulous. I told him only that I thought too many believed it was him, and belief en masse is the surest sign of error. He shook his head, muttered about riddles again, and trailed me toward the chapel. The bells struck the hour, each chime echoing against the wet stone with the melancholy of inevitability. A false solution, yes, but better a false one admitted than a false one embraced. That evening, alone once more, I traced the faint line of wax on the stairwell with my finger. It flaked beneath my touch, fragile yet persistent. I thought of the smoke that had haunted me, of the warning in Latin, of the clenched hand. I thought of 2 candles, burning where one should have sufficed, and I realized that whatever confession I sought, it had not yet been spoken. The scholar's words were only a fragment, a half-truth at best. The real confession, when it came, would arrive in whispers, concealed not in speech but in silence. I closed the crossword with a sigh, the word mirage etched too firmly to erase. A false solution indeed, but sometimes the false solution is as necessary as the true one. It clears the mind, teaches humility, reminds the detective that even in Oxford, where logic is worshipped, truth resists certainty. The candle's smoke still lingered in my thoughts, curling upward, vanishing before it could be grasped, and I, left once more in the haze, prepared myself to wait. It was late afternoon when I first saw her, though the hour seemed nearer dusk. Oxford light has a way of dulling itself when rain hovers in the air, and that day the city appeared painted in shades of pewter. I had walked down toward the river not with purpose, but with the restlessness that follows too much thought and too little progress. Cases stagnate when the mind circles its own deductions. Sometimes the only cure is motion, even if the motion is merely along the towpath where the water slips by with more patience than men. The Thames, though Oxford insists on calling it the Isis, carried leaves and fragments of branch along its grey current. The punts, abandoned for the season, lay roped to their moorings, gathering rain in shallow pools. It was here, beside the cracked stone steps that descended from St. Ethelwald's gardens, that I noticed her. She stood alone, wrapped in a dark coat, her gloved hands resting on the rail, as though steadying herself against some invisible sway. Her face, pale against the shadow of her hat, was turned toward the water, but her eyes didn't follow the current. They seemed fixed upon something deeper, something neither of us could see. Lewis had gone to fetch reports from the constable. I was grateful for his absence. His presence would have broken the spell of silence that held the air. I approached slowly, footsteps muted by the sodden ground. She did not turn at once. When she did, it was with the composure of someone who had already anticipated company. There was no startle, no surprise, only the faintest narrowing of the eyes, as if to measure whether I was a friend or an interruption. She named herself without prompting, a widow of one of the college's benefactors, long associated with St. Ethelwald's, frequent visitor to its library. Her voice was steady, yet its steadiness carried effort. She spoke of the dead man as an acquaintance, a man of intellect and rigidity, whose devotion to his work sometimes trespassed upon cruelty. He had, she said, once confided in her about a manuscript he wished never to see the light of day. She repeated his words with a careful precision that suggested memory had been rehearsed many times in private. I asked her why she stood by the river. She smiled faintly, though the smile lacked warmth. "Water cleanses," she murmured. "It carries things away." Then, after a pause, she added, "And sometimes it returns what should have remained hidden." I thought of the Latin warning again, of false illumination, of truths that resurface in unwelcome places. Her words, like the river, carried more than they revealed. She produced from her coat a folded slip of paper, damp at the corners. It had been given to her, she claimed, by the dead man a week before his death. He had pressed it upon her with a seriousness she had not understood. I unfolded it there on the steps, careful not to let the drizzle smear the ink. It was a crossword clue, written in "His cramped hand flow conceals loss 5." Beneath it, in pencil, he had scribbled possible answers: river, Ravel, riven. None satisfied him. None satisfied me. Yet the gesture itself to entrust a clue to her, rather than to a colleague, seemed significant. Did he trust her more than those within his walls, or was she merely a safer confessor? She watched me as I studied the paper. Her gaze did not waver, and I sensed in it a knowledge she would not yet voice. I asked her if she had shown this to anyone else. She shook her head once, firmly. She had waited until now, uncertain whether his death had made the clue meaningless or essential. I thanked her, though gratitude felt inadequate. She turned back to the water, her profile etched against the darkening sky, and for a moment I felt I was intruding upon a ritual older than both of us. As I left her there, I considered the clue again. Flow conceals loss. 5 letters. River, yes, but too obvious. Raveled to tangle, riven torn apart. The dead man had not chosen an answer because perhaps the answer was not meant to be chosen. The clue was itself the message that in flow, in concealment, in loss, something essential had been hidden. And perhaps, like the river, it would return only when least expected. Back in my rooms, I set the slip beside the other crosswords, their grids like silent witnesses waiting for testimony. The river still clung to me, its smell of damp reeds, its slow, relentless pull, the figure of the woman standing against its current. Lewis returned with his reports, but his words blurred into background. I was listening instead to the sound of water moving through stone arches, to the silence of her voice when she said water carries things away. That night, as the candle burned lower, I filled in the crossword square, riven, not because it was correct, but because it felt truest. Torn apart, a life, a manuscript, a college, a city. Oxford itself was always riven between light and shadow, knowledge and secrecy, truth and its false illumination, and I, standing by the river, had only begun to sense the depth of what flowed beneath. It was in the manuscript room that the silence pressed hardest. The library above, with its shelves and familiar rustle of turning pages, still carried the breath of human presence. But here, beneath stone arches and locked cabinets, the air was older, colder, more intimate with dust than with speech. One entered not as a reader, but as a trespasser. And I, guided by keys reluctantly produced by the sub-warden, felt the weight of intrusion more keenly than most. The room smelled of vellum and polish, of iron hinges and neglected lamps. Each cabinet seemed less a container than a coffin. The dead lived here in ink, their thoughts preserved yet inaccessible, hidden behind glass and regulation. It was in such a place, I reminded myself, that a man had sought both refuge and concealment, and where he may have found his death. The candle's smoke lingered, faintly still as if refusing to be extinguished. Lewis had remained above, preferring chatter with the porter to the cold vault below. I welcomed his absence, though his absence was rarely far from mind. Alone, I could listen to the silence more carefully, and in silence one hears what noise conceals. My footsteps echoed along the flagstones, carrying questions for which no voice yet offered answers. The manuscript lay in a case toward the rear of the room, its title written in a hand that demanded reverence, Miscellanea Theologica, circa 1620. The binding was cracked, the corners scuffed, yet the weight of it was undeniable. Margins crowded with Latin and Greek, as the catalogue had promised. Yet it was not the theology that interested me, it was the margins, the whispers pressed between printed lines, the ghostly commentary of a restless reader. And it was here that I found what the dead man had both feared and preserved. I bent low, the glass fogging faintly from my breath, and traced the annotations with my eyes. At first glance they were ordinary citations, references, the self-importance of a scholar who cannot resist correcting even the dead. But then I saw letters faintly etched, not written but scratched as though with a pin or nail rather than a pen. The inked words told one story, the scored ones another. An inscription within the margin, half hidden, half revealed. I whispered it aloud without meaning to lux mendax lumen est, the same warning, the same Latin phrase that had been scrawled on the slip beside the body. Coincidence is rare in such matters, repetition less still. The dead man had not invented his warning in a moment of fear. He had taken it from here, from this hidden inscription, carved long before his time. He had stumbled upon a voice that echoed centuries forward, a voice that spoke of false light, of deceit disguised as illumination. No wonder he had been unsettled. Truth borrowed from the past often terrifies more than truth invented in the present. Yet there was more. At the bottom margin, beneath a line of Greek, another scratch, fainter still. A name, perhaps, though the letters were uncertain. I pressed closer, the cold of the glass seeping into my skin. It might have been the beginning of a surname, truncated, abandoned. Or it might have been nothing at all, the hesitation of a distracted hand. But I felt the tug of significance, the way one feels a loose thread in a tapestry. Tugged gently, it might unravel everything. As I stared, I thought of the woman by the river, her words about water carrying things away and returning them. Perhaps this inscription was such a return, something meant to be lost, but resurfacing centuries later, claiming a life not its own. I remembered the folded slip she had given me, the clue scribbled in the dead man's hand. Flow conceals loss. 5. Here, the loss concealed the truth of the inscription, hidden beneath ink, carried by time, returned now with fatal consequence. Bibicia. Deduction flickered like candlelight, unsteady, incomplete. Yet it was enough to chill me. For if the dead man had feared the exposure of this inscription, others might have desired it. Ambition does not discriminate between truth and falsehood. It grasps at whatever shines. To prove such an inscription authentic, to link it to a revered hand, could transform reputations. And in Oxford, reputations are as lethal as daggers. Lewis arrived then, his boots clumsy on the flagstones. "Cold down here, sir," he muttered, blowing into his hands. He asked if I had found anything. I told him only that the dead man's fears were not his alone, that others might have shared them, twisted them, profited from them. He frowned, as always resistant to riddles, and turned back toward the stairs. I lingered. I could not leave just yet. The smoke of the candle still lingered faintly, though no flame burned. I knew it now, not as an illusion, but as a reminder light, once extinguished, still leaves its trace. That evening, in my room, I unfolded the crossword again. A clue stared back at me. Hidden writing discovered at last. 11. I had not dared answer it before. Now the solution seemed obvious. Inscription. I wrote it in, the letters heavy beneath my pen. 11 letters, each a confirmation that what had been hidden was now revealed, though only to me. Yet even revelation is not resolution. The crossword was complete in that moment, but the case remained jagged, unfinished, resistant to neatness. I poured a whiskey, let its warmth settle against the damp in my bones, and thought of the faint scratches in the margins of a 17th century book. Words written without ink, carved into silence, carried forward into death. A hidden inscription that had crossed centuries to claim another scholar's life. And I wondered, as I often have, whether truth is ever truly uncovered, or whether we merely carve new words over the old, leaving behind only palimpsests of fear and desire. The candle guttered beside me, smoke curling upward in thin threads. I watched it vanish and felt again the presence of the dead man, the weight of his clenched hand, the urgency of his warning. False light, false solution, false certainty, and beneath it all, hidden still, an inscription waiting to be read. It is the second candle that still troubles me. The first can be explained away the dead man's own, guttering down beside his catalogue, its wax hardened into a pale pool of inevitability. But the second, glimpsed only in the porter's frightened recollection, suggested by dripped wax on a stair, hinted at by the lingering smoke in rooms where no flame should have been, the second candle resists explanation. And in its resistance lies the heart of the matter. Oxford by night is never wholly dark. Lamps sputter along High Street, bicycles wheel past with lamps swinging, the river carries its faint glimmer beneath the bridges. Yet within college walls there is a different darkness, dense and listening, broken only by what men bring with them: a lantern, a match, a candle. Whoever carried that second flame did so not for comfort, but for secrecy. The candle's light is the most private of illuminations, too weak to guide the crowd, too strong to hide from the attentive. To carry it is to confess an intent that shuns scrutiny. I walked the cloisters again that night, the air heavy with mist, the stones slick beneath my shoes. Each archway held its own shadow, each corner its own hesitation. The porter had spoken of light moving behind the library door long after midnight, two flames separate in their rhythm. I tried to imagine the scene of one scholar hunched over the catalogue, his candle steady in its despair, another arriving with his own flame trembling in the draught, eyes fixed on what he meant to claim or conceal. Did they speak? Did they argue? Or did silence bind them more tightly than words? Lewis was not with me. He had retired early, muttering about headaches and the futility of watching stones for answers. His absence allowed me a certain freedom to linger, to think, to listen. The sound of water dripping from the gutters was a metronome, measuring time more steadily than my own restless thoughts. I paused beneath the stairwell, where the wax I had once touched still clung to the rail. By lamplight it was barely visible, but I knew it was there. The second candle had left its trace as surely as the first. In my pocket, the crossword whispered again. The clue was one I had long avoided. Twin flames mark hidden path 7. That evening, the answer arrived unbidden. Beacons, but the word felt wrong in its optimism. A beacon guides these flames. Perhaps, I thought, the setter had meant not guidance, but betrayal. Two lights leading astray, two beacons toward ruin. I penciled the answer nonetheless, though my hand wavered as I did so. It was close to midnight when I returned to my room. The city outside lay muffled, the sound of rain absorbed into stone. I poured a whiskey, let its warmth unspool the chill of the cloisters, and sat again with the crossword spread before me. Beacons, a false solution perhaps, but the only one the letters would permit. I stared at it until the word blurred, the letters dissolving into flame. Two beacons, two candles, two figures in the dark. The symmetry was too perfect to ignore. There was a knock then, faint but insistent. Midnight visitors are rarely welcome, though they are often the most honest. I opened the door to find the sub-warden standing awkwardly in the corridor, his gown draped loosely, his face pale beneath the flickering gaslight. He asked if he might speak, his voice strained with courtesy that barely masked unease. I let him in, offered him a chair, and poured him nothing. He sat stiffly, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed not on me but on the crossword lying between us. He spoke of responsibility, of reputation, of the fragility of institutions. The death, he said, had shaken the college rumours already spread beyond the walls. He feared scandal more than truth. His words flowed with practiced solemnity, but his eyes betrayed distraction. They darted often toward the candle on my desk, watching its flame as though it accused him. I wondered then whether he too had carried a candle that night, whether his was the second flame the porter glimpsed. When I asked directly where he had been after midnight, he hesitated only a moment too long. In Oxford, a hesitation is as good as an admission. He muttered of correspondence, of late work, of a lamp that had burned low. His hands betrayed him further. They smoothed his gown, gripped the chair, tightened against themselves until the knuckles whitened. Men rarely lie well when seated before silence. Silence always listens more closely than words. I did not press. To press is to close doors. Instead, I asked him whether he had ever read the margins of the disputed manuscript. His head jerked up, eyes narrowing. He said he had glanced, nothing more, but his voice thinned on the word margins, as though the syllables themselves cut him. I knew then that he had read more than he admitted. Perhaps he had even left his own mark upon the page, scratching into the vellum the very warning that echoed through centuries. Or perhaps he merely feared what others might believe of him if the inscription were laid bare. When he left, his shadow stretched long against the corridor wall, flickering in the lamplight like a flame unsteady in a draught. I closed the door, returned to my chair, and watched my own candle burn lower. The room smelled faintly of smoke, that same insistent reminder that light once carried leaves its trace long after. I thought again of the porter's glimpse of two flames, two figures. One had ended in death. The other still walked the corridors, carrying his secrecy like wax, dripping slowly onto stone. The crossword square stared at me. Beacons. I left it there, though doubt gnawed at the word. Perhaps not beacons, but phantom or will-o'-the-wisp, something that misleads rather than guides. Yet the grid demanded beacons and the case demanded patience. False solutions have their place, even when they burn too brightly. The hour grew late. The whiskey glass stood empty. The candle on my desk guttered, its smoke curling upward into the shadows. I watched it vanish as I had watched too many vanishings, and wondered whether the truth, when it came, would appear as a steady flame, or as the second candle's treacherous flicker, light enough to blind, smoke enough to linger. The night of the final reading arrived without fanfare. Rain slicked the cobbles, gathering in the gullies, while the lamps burned in halos of blurred gold. I remember thinking how little ceremony Oxford requires to make an evening feel historic. A locked door opened, a handful of men and women seated uneasily beneath portraits, a manuscript set carefully on a table. And yet the weight of centuries pressed upon us, as though every volume in the library leaned forward to overhear. The sub-warden had summoned us to the chamber adjoining the manuscript room, a space half-lit by sconces and heavy with the scent of old polish. He claimed it was necessary to establish clarity before the matter spread further. But clarity in Oxford is never a goal, it is merely a posture. What he desired was containment. I suspected he hoped that by reading aloud from the disputed book, by confronting the inscription itself, we might close the circle of rumour and bury the scandal with the dead. He misjudged the appetite of truth, or perhaps he overestimated his own ability to control it. Lewis accompanied me, though reluctantly. He muttered on the way that it was nothing more than scholars frightening themselves with words scratched in margins. Yet he carried himself uneasily, aware perhaps that words can wound more keenly than knives. We entered to find the widow seated by the fire, her gloves still on, her gaze fixed not on us, but on the manuscript resting under glass. Beside her stood the ambitious scholar, his eyes fever-bright, his breath quickened as though he were about to ascend a pulpit. The sub-warden presided, hands folded, voice low as he welcomed us. There were others, too, fellows whose names I scarcely recalled, each wearing the same mask of composure, strained thin by curiosity. The manuscript was opened with ceremony, the glass removed, gloves fitted to hands. The sub-warden read a passage of Latin, the syllables dry, precise, emptied of devotion. It was not the text itself that mattered, but the margins. We all leaned closer when he turned to the annotated page, where the faint scratches whispered through centuries. The phrase revealed itself once more, lux mendax lumen est. False light is still light. He read it aloud, his voice echoing in the chamber. For a moment, the silence that followed was complete, as though the walls themselves absorbed the words. The scholar broke it first. He insisted the hand was genuine, that it belonged to the revered figure whose name had been murmured in every corridor. If authenticated, it would transform understanding of the period, of the theology, of the man himself. His voice rang with triumph, his hands trembling as he gestured. The sub-warden countered with measured doubt, arguing the strokes were too irregular, the placement suspect, the medium unorthodox. Their voices rose, one with ambition, the other with fear. And in their clash the dead man's absence grew heavier, as though he too leaned over the manuscript, warning us once again of false light. It was then that I noticed the widow's hands. She still wore her gloves, though the room was warm. One hand rested on her lap, fingers curled inward, the shape unmistakable, as if she grasped something hidden within the glove. A clenched hand. I thought of the dead man's final gesture, the way he too had closed his hand around nothing, or around something removed. The echo was too sharp to ignore. I watched as she shifted, the faintest tremor running through her wrist, betraying more than her still face revealed. I turned then to the crossword folded in my pocket. One clue remained blank. Truth exposed in final reading, 10, I had pondered it for days. That night, as the voices clashed around me, the answer flickered into focus. Revelation. The word fitted perfectly, too perfectly, though in Oxford, revelation rarely settles anything. I wrote it quietly, my pencil pressing hard against the paper, as if the act itself could summon clarity. Yet even as I wrote, I knew it was only another false solution, another candle's smoke curling upward. The reading continued, margins were debated, hands compared, theories unspooled. Lewis grew restless beside me, muttering that nothing had been proved, that men were fighting ghosts. I half agreed. Yet ghosts often hold more sway than the living. I found myself studying each face in turn, the scholar's fever, the sub-warden's caution, the widow's clenched glove. Each carried light of its own, false or otherwise. Each cast shadows. At length the sub-warden declared the session ended. He closed the manuscript with a firmness that sounded almost like a verdict. Yet the room did not disperse easily. The widow rose, offered a brief nod, and slipped away toward the cloisters. The scholar lingered, whispering furiously to anyone who would listen, while the sub-warden busied himself with the case. I remained where I was, the crossword before me, the word revelation filling its square. It looked final, conclusive, but I knew better. In Oxford, nothing ends with revelation. It only begins again in whispers, in smoke, in silence. Later, walking back across the quad, I considered the scene. A dead man's warning, a second candle, a hidden inscription, a widow's clenched hand. Each was a clue, yet none arranged themselves into the pattern I longed for. The bells tolled midnight, solemn and unyielding. I paused beneath the arches, listening to their echo fade. "There is no hour later than midnight," he had said. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps all we ever have is the final reading, and the knowledge that even revelation leaves us still searching in the dark. The library is never entirely silent, though it often pretends to be. Even in darkness the walls breathe, the wood groans, and somewhere in the rafters a bird stirs as if uncertain of its place among words instead of sky. I walked there alone last night, long after the others had retired, long after the candles had gutted. The porter, perhaps too weary to argue, handed me the key without protest. He knew as well as I did that some questions cannot be left outside until morning. I carried no light of my own. The gas lamps along the quad had dimmed, and the stars above were veiled in clouds. Within the library, shadows pressed close, yet the outlines of shelves and ladders revealed themselves by degrees as though reluctant to emerge. Each step echoed faintly the sound of trespass. There is no solitude heavier than that of a place built for many when occupied by one. I found my way to the catalogue room, now emptied of its seals, its tables cleared of all but the memory of a body hunched in surrender. The faintest trace of wax still stained the wood, brittle at the edges. I touched it without thinking, as if to reassure myself that it had not been imagined. 2 candles, 2 figures, 2 stories. The symmetry haunted me more than any resolution. I sat where he had sat, the dead man, and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The shelves loomed, their drawers patient, waiting. In the half-light the room resembled a crossword grid, each drawer a square, each label a clue, each silence demanding an answer. I unfolded the puzzle once more, the one I had carried through every hour of this case. Only one clue remained, the last across darkness holds all answers. For I had resisted it until now. Sitting there, I wrote the obvious word, void, and yet the more I looked, the more it seemed not a solution, but a verdict. The air smelled faintly still of smoke, though the candles had long been extinguished. I wondered then if the porter had been right, that smoke lingers longer than memory, that what we believe is gone continues to coil invisibly about us. A scholar dies, a manuscript whispers, a widow clutches her hand as though it still holds something unseen, and I, fool or detective, chase after shadows calling them clues. Yet deduction intrudes even in despair. I recalled the widow's clenched glove, the symmetry of gesture with the dead man's clenched hand. What object might both conceal? Not a key, too jagged, not paper, too fragile, a ring, perhaps, or a seal? Something small, circular, heavy with meaning. The thought flickered, then retreated, unwilling to reveal more. False illumination once again. I rose, walked the length of the room, and paused at the stairwell. There the wax had marked the railing, pale against oak. I bent low, tracing its edge with my finger. 2 drips close together, then a gap, then 2 more. A rhythm, like footsteps. The second candle had not been still, it had moved. Its bearer hesitated, paused, then continued. Perhaps in that hesitation lies everything, a moment of doubt, of decision, of betrayal. But no witness remains to tell me. The darkness thickened, or perhaps my eyes grew weary of straining. I sat again, this time at the far end, where a single narrow window admitted only the faintest grey. My thoughts wandered not toward guilt or innocence, but toward futility. The sub-warden with his polished sorrow, the scholar with his fevered ambition, the widow by the river with her silence, each had carried their candle, each had left their smoke. I could accuse any or none, and Oxford would continue, its cloisters echoing, its libraries breathing, its manuscripts whispering their half-truths into eternity. Still the crossword lay before me, the final grid complete. Revelation, beacons, hazes, inscription, void. A story told in fragments, in words meant for leisure but weighted now with death. I folded it carefully, slid it into my pocket, and felt its shape against my chest like a second heart. Perhaps that is all. An investigation is a crossword never quite finished, a puzzle solved only in part, leaving space for silence. The bells tolled once more, midnight again. Their sound rolled through the darkness, solemn, unyielding, each chime another candle extinguished. I rose, placed my hand against the door, and lingered. Behind me, the library lay in shadow, shelves tall as watchtowers, drawers mute as graves. Ahead, the cloisters waited, wet stone gleaming faintly. I stepped out, closed the door, and heard the lock click like a final punctuation. And yet even as I walked away, I knew the library would not rest. Its darkness was not absence but presence, thick with voices too faint to catch, with light too false to trust. Somewhere within those walls the second candle had burned, had left its wax and its smoke, had guided a hand toward death. Somewhere within an inscription still whispered, waiting for another reader, another midnight. I did not look back. Some places resist farewell. The rain began again, steady, persistent, washing the stones of the quad until they shone like glass. I pulled my coat tighter, felt the crossword still against me, and let the darkness carry me onward. Perhaps in the end, the library held all the answers. Or perhaps it held only the void. In Oxford, the difference is never clear.